get their parking. But while we're waiting, I will tell you a little bit about our upcoming events in the Armenian Studies program. This is actually, I believe, the 7th event that we've had this semester. And we have 2 more and probably a 3rd in December. But our next lecture will be the final lecture in the 3-part series by our visiting professor, Dr. Hrak Papazian. Where are you at, Hrak? Yeah, would you all stand up, please, and let's have a round of applause for him. He and his wife, Mune, are a visiting professor. He's a visiting professor here. Last year, he spent the year at UCLA. He is originally from Lebanon, but is currently living in Armenia and working at the American University of Armenia. For those of you that came to either one of his 2 previous presentations, the overall theme of his work was about the Armenians in contemporary Turkey. So the first lecture was the general picture of the Armenians as they were right after the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923. The second lecture, which was last month actually, actually earlier this month, October 7th, was on the Muslim and Alevi Armenians. Armenians who by birth are Muslim. Armenians who by birth are Muslim, which meant that their parents or grandparents were taken into Turkish or Kurdish families, converted to Islam, and they grew up with an identity in Turkey which was Muslim, and yet they were not accepted by neither the Muslim majority, the Muslims in Turkey, because the Turkish government still considered them by ethnicity to be Armenian. The only way you can be Armenian in Turkey today, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is by your religious identity, not by your ethnic identity. So he talked about that. It was a very interesting presentation. His final presentation will take place on Tuesday, November the 1st here, and it's going to be on the Armenian migrants, the migrants from the Republic of Armenia, who have been moving to Turkey in the last 10, 15 years, maybe more, and are now working, and how do they deal with the question of identity? How are they categorized, or how do they feel living in Turkey as Armenians from the Republic of Armenia? So I encourage all of you to join us for that. And then on Tuesday, November the 15th, we have a very different set of lectures this semester. And we're bringing from Paris, France, Dr. Claude Moutafian, who is one of the senior scholars in the field of Armenian studies, whose field is the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, Kilikia, and he has written a new book on the Armenians of Jerusalem, the Armenian community in Jerusalem, up until the conquest of the Ottoman Turks, which took place in the year 1516, when Sultan Selim the Grim conquered the eastern parts of Anatolia, and for the first time large numbers of Armenians came into the Turkish Empire, but also he conquered the Holy Lands. So his lecture will be on his new book, which is called, again, Jerusalem, Armenians of Jerusalem until the Ottoman Conquest 1516. He's a really great speaker, so I encourage you all to come for that. That's November the 15th. It's also a Tuesday night in the same venue that you're here. So tonight, I want to also thank a special sponsor for tonight's lecture, and that is Clara Busian-Bedrosian. Clara Busian-Bedrosian passed away a few years ago, but in 2019, before she passed away, she established a generous endowment which is going to help sponsor lectures such as this and also scholarships for students. So we want to thank her family, especially Janie Bedrosian, who's here tonight. Thank you, Janie, and please tell your family thank you on our behalf. It's interesting to see how ties to the university last a long time. Mrs. Bedrosian, Clara Busian-Bedrosian, was a longtime educator and a 1958 graduate of Fresno State. And she never forgot her Fresno State roots, and her family has been also close to our program. So once again, thank you. So following the Armenian genocide of 1915, the United States became an important refuge for genocide survivors. I think we all know that. For these survivors, however, even the idea of returning to a homeland emptied of Armenians and filled with memories of death and terror was unthinkable, and few ever saw their beloved homes again once they had left. But slowly, and much later, the survivors' children and then their grandchildren began to make trips to historic Armenia, to Turkey, and to search for their families' lost homes and houses in the towns and villages that they had heard so much about. I think all of us probably that are part Armenian or full Armenian have that same experience. You want to find out about your history and to make contact with that. Many called their journeys pilgrimages. They didn't like the idea of being called tourists. They weren't tourists. They're making pilgrimages. And that is they refer to themselves as pilgrims. And between 2007 and 2015, our guest speaker, Dr. Carel Bertram, traveled with over 100 such pilgrims and was in contact with many more, and it resulted in the book. The book is the book that you'll see outside after our lecture. It's called A House in the Homeland. You see it up here, Armenian Pilgrimages to Places of Ancestral Memory, Stanford University. And tonight, our guest speaker, Dr. Bertram, will talk about those pilgrimages and the impact on the lives of those pilgrims by telling some of their stories. So what was the impact of visiting those historic villages? A little bit about Dr. Carel Bertram. She's a professor emerita of Middle East and Islamic Studies from the Department of Humanities at San Francisco State University. Her master's degree was in Near Eastern Studies from Berkeley, and her PhD in Islamic art history from my alma mater, UCLA. There you go, not Bulldogs, but go Bruins, right? Trained in the visual culture of Ottoman, post-Ottoman era, she uses art, architecture, cities, literature, ethnography, and oral histories to show us and to study how we use space and place to represent ourselves in the world. I've known Carel for many, many years through our association in the Society for Armenian Studies, and we have met frequently on these trips that we take to various parts of the United States pre-COVID, where we meet with people in our field and have given talks and have continued our friendship until today. So I'm very happy that she had been in contact with me, and this has been in the planning for quite a while actually, and so we're really very, very happy to have with us also some of you that have traveled to Turkey with her, and I'm sure she'll mention that. But it's my great pleasure on behalf of the Armenian Studies program to welcome Dr. Carel Bertram. Dr. Bertram.
Thank you so much. I am really honored to be here. Thank you, Barlow, for this nice introduction which frames everything, and for our friendship and all that Fresno State and the Society for Armenian Studies, of which you are the glue, have done for Armenians, but also for historians everywhere. So thank you so much for this. And thank you to the Clara Bedrosian bequest for allowing me to come here. It's extremely special to me to be in Fresno, because this is one of the second homelands of the Armenians who left the homeland of Western Armenia either just before or during the genocide. So it's a special honor for me to be here with all of you. Not to mention that this is the first talk that I've had with real people. So I've been doing Zoom talks, which are okay. You probably have been to several of them, but it's not at all the same. So I'm really happy that I'm here, and especially with you. So this will be a talk about my book, A House in the Homeland, Armenian Pilgrimages to Places of Ancestral Memory. The pilgrim, some of this I'm repeating what Barlow has said, but then you'll get it better the second time, right? The pilgrimages in this book are ones made by the adult children and grandchildren of genocide survivors. And I want to emphasize that these are pilgrims who knew intimately these people. These are not the next generation, it's a very special generation and a special group of people. So they went back to Turkey. They stayed back, they had never been there before, to look for their ancestral villages and towns, and if they were lucky, to find their ancestral houses. And I traveled with them for over 9 years, mostly with Armen Aroyan, whom many of you know. How many have traveled with him? Wonderful. So this will feel familiar to you. So he was the pilgrim's guide and much of our inspiration. And for those of you who went with him or went on your own, I would love to hear your stories. Always. We traveled mainly in small minibuses, sometimes 2 minibuses that were in a caravan. And once, at least once for me, on my very first pilgrimage in 2007 on a grand tour bus. And on that trip, I met Garo and Alice Garigian, who took great care of me, and I'm very grateful to Alice for hosting me and feeding me on this trip. So this is the Homeland map from my book, and I made it to illustrate some of the many places that we went to. They're not all on there, it would be too crowded. But what is this place? Some pilgrims called this Homeland Armenia. Some called it Historical Armenia. Some called it Western Armenia. Some called it Yergir. I was writing all this down as I was listening. And if you look at the mini-map in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the area where we traveled actually fits in what is today's Eastern Turkey. But no pilgrim called their homeland Turkey. Here's the same place, but seen differently. It colors in Western Turkey's Armenian population under the Ottomans and before the genocide. This gives you an idea of how large and dense the Armenian population was in this area. And the colors show, the red shows the densest and the dark orange the next dense, but Armenians were everywhere. So this map shows all of the area that was populated by Armenians. I'm looking at it to make sure I have the right map up there. During the Ottoman period, and even in many of these areas before the Ottomans had come. So this map has both Eastern Turkey, Western Armenia, and what we'll later see as Eastern Armenia. So all of the Armenian area. And the parts of the east, more to the east, Armenians had been there since time immemorial, and certainly some in Western Armenia as well. But what we call Western and what we call Eastern Armenia are not different nations, as you know, but parts of the Armenian homeland that developed somewhat differently and had somewhat of a different culture due to their cultural exchanges with the people who colonized them, but also with their neighbors. Eastern Armenia was historically under Persian, Russian, and Soviet control, and it survived politically. It even became the home of the Armenian Republic. As it turns out, in the end, Western Armenia is also a genocide map. So these are the areas where the survivors came from. Eastern Armenia was not under the Ottomans, so it became a haven for those survivors who could get there. So in other words, Eastern Armenia was not the homeland that the exiles from Western Armenia lost and remembered. The Western Armenian language has its own Western dialect and cultural markers, such as food and music that are distinct from Eastern Armenia. In fact, before the genocide, Western Armenian language was by far the dominant Armenian language and culture, but now it survives mostly in the diaspora. Most Armenians have longed to or have visited the Armenian Republic, and those who do go to visit go, I think, with both joy and relief. This is an Armenia, this is a homeland that truly represents a future. But for Western Armenians, as much as the Republic of Armenia is very much part of their homeland heart, it doesn't have the personal memories of home, some of which, of course, they long to forget. So those are the maps behind my map, which plots pilgrimages by Western Armenians to their Western Armenian homeland. All of these drawings of Armenian houses are to remind us that the pilgrims come longing to find their houses, which they considered their homeland's beating heart. But what became very clear to me was that these pilgrims were never searching for real estate. They were searching for a way to heal a tear in their souls. Among other things, my book documents and explains just how theirs was a spiritual quest and just how many truly did find a pilgrim's reward. I'll start with how these pilgrims began, and then what they felt like. Pilgrimages began, and then what they felt like, and then move on to the part of my book that it turned out, in a great surprise to me, took a very spiritual turn. For what I witnessed was how these pilgrims were able to engage with their painful pasts in ways that were often healing. In other words, I'll share with you some of the deep spiritual dimensions of this trip for many pilgrims, and how I came to understand that the pilgrims knew that they were standing on sacred ground. As I introduce this spiritual dimension, I'll also be introducing some of the spiritual rituals that were directed towards personal healing. And as I said, this was all a great surprise to me as I started to feel what I was feeling. And I had some long conversations with my mentor at the University of Texas in Austin, and I said, I don't know where this is taking me. I don't think that a scholar is supposed to be dealing with something so deeply heartfelt and spiritual. And she said, just write what you see. So that's what I did. But I'll begin logically enough with how these pilgrimages began, as it sets the tone for what follows. After the genocide, there were some descendants and even some survivors who were able to return to their villages. And I do have chapters on those in my book. But it was Armin Aroyan from Glendale, or Monrovia, thank you, from Monrovia now, who opened the door to Anatolia. And it was quite inadvertent for him. In the late 1980s, he had gone to Turkey as an engineer with McDonnell Douglas, and there, when he was there, he decided to follow an urge and visit his grandfather's Armanak's village. The village was called Jibin. On hearing that an Armenian native son, had come to the village, Armin was met by a few of the women who had been left there as little girls. Their parents had left them as they went off on the marches, hoping that they would be taken care of, and of course, hoping that they would return for their children. 30 girls were left behind in Jibin, but none of the mothers. So the girls were taken in by Muslim families and married to the local sons. And some of these husbands and sons came with the daughters and with their children to meet Armin too. One of the girls was named Maryam, a first cousin to Armin's father. So here he is with Maryam's Jibinsi granddaughter, who is, of course, Armin's third cousin. And as word spread around that he was there, he found that he had another third cousin as well, who was living in Aintab and was an attorney. Although the girls were converted to Islam, there was no secret anywhere about their Armenian pasts. They remembered their Armenian names, they remembered their Armenian surnames, all of which ended in gil, not yan, as gil was used in the local dialect. Armen was named for this Jibinsi grandfather and took the family last name, but outside of Jibin it was changed from Arogil to Arayan. On meeting Armen, one of the Left Behind girls said she remembered Armen's grandfather, whom she called Arogil. "Ah, their house is right over there," she said, "on the other side." Her son then asked her, "So, did you know him?" To which she responded, "Ah, yes, evet, of course I knew him. He was one of our neighbors." They were all speaking Turkish, as the Armenian language had been made illegal in Jibin, as it was in many other Armenian villages and towns. So it was shocking for Armen when one villager did speak Armenian. He was the son of one of the girls who was left behind. But more importantly, he had become blind due to smallpox when he was very young, and his mother managed to send him to Beirut for Armenian education and care. So when he returned, he spoke Western Armenian, he knew Armenian prayers, he knew Armenian history, and he knew Armenian songs, which he loved to sing. He'd never married, and so unlike the other Armenian girls who did marry, there was no reason for him to really become a practicing Muslim. And so he kept his Christian faith, although he kept that kind of under the wire. He had no one to speak Armenian to, so he kept his language alive by listening to the radio from Beirut. So when Armen greeted him in Armenian, he immediately responded with "Vokchun," hail. And then he almost fainted with joy because he hadn't spoken Armenian to anyone for over 50 years. When Armen returned to the United States, he told this story. "Our villages are there, our houses are there, our orchards are there, and there are Armenians, although most are Muslims. And really, many of these people may be our cousins as well." And so when he said that, at each presentation he made, 100 hands went up, take me too. And so this became his life's work. So now I'll tell you a little bit about what these pilgrimages are like. But by the time I joined, sorry, I'm having trouble with my cursor, which has disappeared. We go. Okay, sorry. By the time I joined the pilgrimages, which is in 2007, and he had been doing them since about 1992, Armen had seen a great deal of Western Armenia. He knew where many, but not all, of the villages are. He had traveled these difficult mountainous roads, and getting to a village was pretty hard and meant that the pilgrims with him had to do some hard walking. So with him, as those of you who went know, that these pilgrimages had their physical challenges, and we won't mention the early hotels. But the emotional challenges were a lot harder. Everyone on the bus felt anxious. For outside the bus windows were people whom they thought just might have been, or probably were, genocide perpetrators, or certainly their children, even their grandchildren. But often, although not always, on meeting them, pilgrims found them to be kind, especially in more recent years. Here, a man at a service station outside Diyarbakir gives Karen Derderian a purple scarf with a tatted floral border because her family was also from there. You should have worn your scarf today. but she was there with us.
This one's for the stop.
In fact, many faces reminded pilgrims of their own families, and they were always stopping to take pictures that looks just like Aunt Sosik, or this looks just like my cousin or my niece or my nephew. But kind as the local people might be, the people themselves were often clueless. On finding that the pilgrims were Armenian, they might say, "Welcome back, this is your home." And then they added this really strange question, "But why did you leave?" Some pilgrims answered and some chose not to. Inside the bus, it was sometimes celebratory and sometimes ponderously heavy. Most people had joined the tour individually or sometimes in couples or small families. So they shared their stories with each other, where they lived in the United States or some in other countries. And of course, they soon found that they knew. They often shifted to the bus mic and told their family village stories, which were variations on several shared themes. The knock at the door, the disappearance of father and grandfather and young men, and the deportation marches. But there were also stories of a before time, the close-knit family, Christmas, Easter at the house, a house with a grand staircase, a wedding, a baptism, and the foods, of course, the foods that were made. And I collected a lot of recipes, and I'm always eager for more. As they shared their stories, they often showed photographs that they had brought along. I was amazed by how many they had brought with them. Along with their photos, they brought a variety of other town and village memory objects that were also, for them, like physical claims to their histories. The first time I realized what all was happening and what was being carried in their luggage was when I traveled in 2009 with Marianne Kazanjian, who brought a whole folder, a huge folder of cherished possessions that tied her to her house in Yozgat. Here's Yozgat, just above the dead center of Anatolia. Like nearby centers, such as Kayseri and Sivas, Yozgat was not part of what was officially the Ottoman Armenia, but since the 18th century, it had been a populous and lively center of Armenian life. One of the most precious objects that she carried with her in her bursting folder was, of course, a copy of a hand-drawn family tree that her great-uncle Vahan, who had come to Philadelphia in 1910, had made of her family, and she was very close to this uncle. She also carried a color copy of a painting that he had made from memory of the town of Yozgat. And Marianne had looked at it for a long time, and she was assumed, I guess, that the big building in the center was the family mansion of the wealthy family that she had heard about, and represented the house of her family, whose picture, naturally, she had brought of people who had lived in that house. So this is the photograph that Mary Ann brought. Her great-uncle Vahan's parents are in the middle, and her own father is the little boy who is carrying a Panama hat and is also holding on to Grandpa's hand. And I wondered how she ever got this, but we assume that the grandparents had sent it to Vahan before the genocide. The big building in the painting turned out not to be her house at all. It was a government building. But it took some sleuthing for Armin to find out where that house was. And it was kind of surprising that it took so much work on his part, because it is a huge mansion, and it survived intact. However, It had been made into, excuse me, an Ottoman Turkish ethnographic museum, and it had absolutely no indication that there was any Armenian history behind it. However, Armen, who is so great at this, knew local people, and the local Armenians and Turks had known that it was the Aslanian house. So Marianne and her husband Ed and everyone on the bus went inside as museum visitors. I loved it particularly when Ed stood back, he got into the foyer, and there their guards are holding their rifles, standing there, and he made a quick assessment that they probably didn't speak English, and then he said to them, "This is my wife's house, you're fired." That took a lot of courage. But even though the painting didn't have her house, in her mind it always represented that loving and wealthy, prosperous life in Yozgat. So Marianne generously offered it to me to use as the cover of my book, and I'm thrilled. In fact, sometimes I call it our book when I'm talking to Marianne. Robert Duranian, traveling with his mother Dorothy, had brought his grandfather's photo from Fresno to the village of Husnik on the slopes of the Golden Plain of Harpert. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was a predominantly Armenian village. The mother and son used this map made by a genocide survivor from Husnik named Peter Gulkasian, and I actually traveled with his daughter there. And with Armen's help, they found their house and even met that house's new owner, who was very nice to them. Robert stood in front of it, holding the photo, and this is what he said.
Grandfather, a Fresno farmer.
Can you hear it?
He loved Hisanek.
No?
Every 4th of July, he hit all the Hiseks.
You're turning it up?
Yeah, thought it was. It stopped.
Farmer. He loved Hisanek. Every 4th of July, he hit all the Hiseks from Fresno, would go up into the Genograph Park and play Pavli and have a good time, drink lots of beer and Iraqi. And they just loved Hisanek. It was their dream. Grandpa, we brought you back.
So he says, "Grandpa, I brought you back." Well, Robert may have felt that he was bringing his grandfather back, but he certainly didn't leave him there. He took his grandfather's photo back to the States with him. But many pilgrims did leave their photographs there because they decided to hide them in their lost houses if they found them, or in places they felt stood for their houses. And this is where we begin to get to the spiritual and the rituals that I mentioned to you. Although it surprised me at first, I saw and read about this happening a lot. In my book, I discuss this leaving of family photos as rituals in which the photos become votives that ask for something, or even ex-photos that show gratitude. This was true for Lynn Derderian, who traveled with her sister Karen Derderian and their cousin Peter Balakian, who had arranged this trip for his whole family, including his then 82-year-old mother, which used to sound old, but doesn't any longer. In their minibus, they headed for their family's city of Diyarbakir. It had once had a large Armenian population centered around the great cathedral, Sur Giragos. Lynn sat with Peter, they're very good friends, in the front of the bus as the bus drove towards Diyarbakir, and Peter said, "This looks like Colorado, the Southwest." But Lynn, who like her sister had been raised in Fresno, disagreed. "No, no, Peter. She's Interstate 5 going to Fresno. This is the San Joaquin Valley." And you know, I felt the same way when I was driving to here to be at Alice's. I thought, oh, I see what she means. Later, Lynn told me the whole notion of home started happening at that moment. Along with a printed family tree that Peter had made of their family and published in his book, Black Dog of Fate, which many of you may have read, Lynn also carried photographs of her mother's family when they had lived in Diyarbakir. She knew that she couldn't find the house because the house had been torched at the beginning of the genocide. So her plan was to take her photographs to Giragos and possibly hide them near one of the altars. Certainly her grandmother, Nafina, had been married in that church, and she knew for sure it was the place where both her mother and her mother's sister had been baptized. And she was pretty certain that all the lives of her Diyarbakir family had histories there, including her father's family, who was also from Diyarbakir. The bus arrived late at night to the hotel in Diyarbakir, and Lynn couldn't sleep. Instead, she spontaneously added the names of her Diyarbakir families, her Diyarbakir father's family, to the one that Peter had made of the mother's side of the family, of their communal grandmother, Nafina. She brought this new list down to breakfast in the morning and showed it to Flora, another pilgrim, and she also showed it to me. So I took this picture. I was so impressed. Arriving at the church, Lynn lit candles and read the names of her entire family. It was very powerful for her, as she had never said some of these names aloud in her life. As she explained it, it seemed at that moment that she was not in a church, but in a place not quite attached to this world. In fact, she was at her own sacred center, a kind of house world center. And so she placed all these objects under the cloth of the central altar. And then she felt very sad, but she also felt very full. As she said, I was connected to the family I didn't know, the people who were murdered, but also I was filled with gratitude for those who survived and gratitude that I was there right then. She used the same words as, what she felt that she had brought them back. So she used the same words that Robert in Husinig had used, Grandpa, I brought you home. But I'm convinced that something else was going on. And in this ritual, she was not bringing them home at all. The photos of and the names of the people that she left behind were tied to a situation that was so traumatic that no one in the family had wanted to talk about it. Lynn knew that the images of her grandmother, alone with her children, newly having lost her husband, her parents, her siblings, and the rest of her family, was not something that her grandmother, Nafina, would want brought back to life. And she, Nafina, had never wanted to return. Nafina's daughter, Araxi, who is in this picture and on this trip, had told her that. In fact, many descendants, survivor parents and grandparents had said they would never, ever want to go back. Some had horrible and brutal memories, as evidenced by their nightmares and their screams in the night. But then there was one pilgrim who said that her grandmother had said, why would I want to go back when here I am, where you can just pull a chain and a light goes on? So there were different reasons. What seemed clear for Lynn, and for others who hid these votive photos, is that the photographs that they carried were not proxies for their family. They did not become the parent at all. Instead, they represented the pilgrim's own hope and needs for solace. In other words, a votive is always an extension of the devotee. What Lynn hid were her commitment to their memories and to all that the people in them had loved, and to remembering how they had lost it. Lynn, of course, would leave, but the votive she left behind was meant to stand not for the people in it, but for her permanent devotion to what emanated from this place. And now, furthermore, she herself had marked and experienced this place as her own. She had participated by putting that photo there. She had participated in her family's history. And this satisfaction of continuity made in the sacred space where the ancestors' spirits listened was her spiritual pilgrim's reward. So what seemed clear for Lynn and for others who place such votives is that the photographs that are left behind stand for being a part of this place. It is perhaps the only place to make this clear to the spirits. Another ritual